Hello and welcome back to Adventures in Miniature. Today we'll be painting up an Allied Pounder from Dust 1947. This design reminds me a lot of the real-world Sherman tank, so this is something I'm going to keep in mind when I'm choosing my colour, camouflage and accessories. The first step was to dismantle the model as much as I could without damaging it. Mostly this was separating the chassis from the legs so we can get a better angle on the insides. Once that was done, I spray painted all the parts with Death Guard green from Games Workshop to create a smooth base coat to work on. GW sprays work really well as an undercoat and generally match up really well with their paintball counterparts. Once the undercoat was dry, I came in with some black to base the metal parts of the walker, particularly the large wheels around the joints and the hydraulics. I was trying to pick out the parts that I felt couldn't be painted because they'd be in constant motion. I also did this with the coaxial mounted gun, the exhaust vents on the back of the walker and the drive unit on the front of the chassis. This was a bit fiddly, but ultimately it's worth it to add a few more interesting areas to the walker. I've said before that it can be difficult to make military inspired models interesting due to how simple the colour schemes tend to be, but I feel this shifts the challenge away from painting every little detail with different colours, and I find it's more about adding wear and dirt in order to help tell a story with the model. An interesting thing I came across while watching through some reference material was that armoured fighting vehicles aren't just weapons, they're also the crew's home, and I think that's something I'm going to try and keep in mind with future projects. I ended up using 2 coats of black to make sure the parts were well covered, and then went back with some Death Guard green to clean up any overlap. In order to keep myself busy whilst the black was drying, I moved on to the turret details using some liquid cement, which gives a stronger bond than superglue. I put the main gun together, ready for painting later. After that, I moved on to base coating the jerry can on the side of the turret with some Army Painter Angel Green, ready to come back later for weathering. Now that the black on the walker legs has dried, it's time to come back and do some dry brushing with some GW Lead Belcher. I love using this colour for metallics because it's quite subdued and dulls down really well once you put a wash on it to give you a really quick and easy feel of metal parts. Dry brushing is a really great, easy to use technique that you can use to achieve plenty of great effects. You can afford to be quite rough with this and then come back again later to clean it up. For this walker, I wanted to try out some ideas for painting camouflage. I've seen some really nice looking camouflage designs online that looked like they were done with an airbrush, which I wanted to emulate. Not having an airbrush though, I decided to try using a dry brushing stippling technique to gradually build up the pattern in light layers that would feel a bit more organic and faded by time. I was really happy with how this turned out, and it was really easy to get a nice effect quite quickly. I think with these sorts of details, it's very easy to go too far and it's quite important to know when to stop. With this particular pattern, I tried to keep it quite simple, using a light grey to stipple patterns across the hull, trying not to get carried away. I wanted it to look like something that the crew would have applied themselves in the field. I did have a play with adding some brown into the pattern, but in the end it came out looking a bit too busy, so I ultimately came back and used grey to cover it up. It's important to remember that it's okay to try things, and if they don't work, you can always go back and paint over it. But even in failure, you'll still learn something from that you might end up using later on. At the moment, the walker still looks a bit bland, but that's all going to change once we start getting onto the weathering. Using some more Death Guard green, I painted up the mounts for the searchlight and the turret mounted MG, which I'm going to put to the side and attach later on. Now we're onto the washing stage. It's time to break out the Nuln Oil to help define the panels and lines. I found that I use washes a little differently for vehicles, focusing largely on using the washes to draw out the lines in the plates of the walker and trying to avoid covering the whole thing in a wash. I found myself being much more sparing and selective about which areas to shade. I also used the Nuln Oil to add some organic looking buildup of dirt and grease to the exhaust vents, building this up in layers to create a natural looking accumulation of grime until I was happy with the look. There's no real formula to this, it's pretty much just keep going until you're happy. I used some more Nuln Oil on the drive section and gave all the little studs and bolts a quick dab too. This helps make them feel like they've been out in the elements a bit more. I wanted to help tie the walker into the overall look of my other allied units while giving it an identifying marker. So I used some Mechanicus Standard Grey to paint a vertical stripe down one of the armor segments on the leg, which is going to act as a base for some yellow. I find yellow is a very frustrating colour to paint just because it tends to be very thin, but with a good base coat and some patience building up layers of colour, you'll end up with a good smooth coat. With this particular unit, I wasn't too concerned with creating a perfectly smooth coat, as I wanted it to feel like the camouflage pattern and that it was applied in the field by the crew. With the first round of washes done, it's time to move on to the weathering, and this was an opportunity for me to try a technique someone had suggested, which was to take a bit of sponge and blot on the colours I was going to use for the weathering. This is by no means a new idea, but it's the first time I've had an opportunity to try it, and I was really pleased with the result. I started by building up the wear on the metal parts to try and convey some paint chipping and corrosion. So I took some typhus corrosion, dipped my sponge in, and dabbed off the excess on a bit of paper. Once it was producing the sort of pattern I was happy with, I used that to blot the paint onto the corners and around the edges, really searching for areas where paint might have been chipped away or spots that would have been susceptible to corrosion by the elements. The great thing about using this technique is that it creates some good random patterns that would be really hard to do by hand. You just keep building up these layers until you've got something that you're happy with. Now that's done, I took a moment to put some white on the two front lights, which was going to create a nice bright background for the red and green I wanted to use. In retrospect, I think I would have maybe chosen to use an amber color or a yellow, but I'm still happy with the result, and there's no reason not to use that in another vehicle later on. A little dot of liquid cement to attach the machine gun to the turret, and we're moving on. With the typhus corrosion dried, I came back with a quick dry brushing of lead belcher to create some patches of exposed metal, particularly around the corners and hard edges where the elements would have had the most opportunity to eat away at the paint and the metal. I find adding a little bit of a metallic hint to the edges of a vehicle is a really good way to convey wear simply, and it's an almost instant payoff. Like many things though, it's important not to get too carried away and accidentally paint the whole thing silver. Back to the turret, I'm going to base the MG in black before coming back with some more lead belcher to dry brush over it. For the barrel of the main gun, I wanted to blacken the end a little bit to make it look like it's been fired recently. I started with a dry brushing of black, which I then faded into a dark brown. To help tie it together, I used some Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. Back to the body of the walker again, and I'm going to add some dirt onto the feet and the sides of the walker, starting with oak brown to dry brush lightly up the legs and into the areas that I thought dirt might accumulate. I followed this up with Steel Legion drab, building up the dirt in the same way, and then finally with Xandri dust for a highlight. I used the same techniques to add some wear to the turret, trying to add some dirt under the jerry cans and corrosion around the edges. Using a bit of sepia tone, I added some colour to the exhaust vents and to the gears on the legs to make it look a bit more greasy. With the bulk of the walker done, I decided to use some stowage pieces to add on to the turret. I think these little extras can help add a much more lived-in feel to the walkers. There being limited space on the turret, I went with a roll of camouflage netting and some extra jerry cans. I got these from a set of resin stowage pieces that I was able to pick up on eBay, which are going to fit nicely on the free side of the turret. I based both of these in Mechanicus Grey and I'm going to come back to colour them in when they're dry. For the camo netting, I started with a dry brushing of some Death Guard green and then using Steel Legion drab and Army Painter Oak brown to stipple on a camouflage pattern. After that, I used a green shade to darken up the whole thing and create some shadows in the folds. The jerry cans were painted up in dark green and weathered before using Rhinox hide to do the straps on both the cans and the camo roll. These are ready to go onto the turret now, so a quick dab of super glue and on they go. A little while ago I put a poll out on the Dust Facebook page to help find a name for this model, and amongst some great suggestions I settled on Pinocchio, which immediately stood out to me. So I'm going to use some white to paint that onto the main gun before dirtying it up a little bit. I took a little time to paint up the base, adding a few tufts of burnt grass and applying some snow texture around the base. This was a mixture of Snowflock and Mod Podge, which I mixed up in an old paint pot. One of the advantages to doing this is that while it's got its limitations, it made me a lot less stingy with the texture paste. And with that, we're all done. This was a fairly quick project to paint up, and it was really satisfying to add all the weathering, especially trying out some new techniques that I've seen other people using on the community pages. I think it was definitely worth investing in a few extra bits of stowage to add some more character onto the final piece. I think adding dirt and grime along with some basing can do a lot of work for you, and it can really make a simple scheme look much more alive. I'm really pleased with how the camouflage pattern worked out, and I'm looking forward to using it again in a future project. All in all, this was a really nice walker to paint up, and it's got lots of personality, even unpainted. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to give it a like, subscribe and comment below to let me know what you thought. Thanks to all the guys who suggested names for this one, particularly Dennis Bauer, who suggested Pinocchio. I'll be putting links to the Dust 1947 website if you'd like to pick one of these up for yourself, and check out some of the other models that they've got up for grabs. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.